So our second lecturer today will be on this panel will be Professor Ernest Petrič. He's a very busy person, so we are glad that he joined our conference because he is one of the most important Slovenian intellectuals of his time. Professor Petrič had quite a few careers in his life. He was a diplomat, a politician, a constitutional judge, and a lecturer at various faculties over the world. To illustrate his outstanding career, we will take a quick overview over his work. From 1967 to 1972, he served on the Executive Council of the Slovene government. He was with the University of Ljubljana from 1976 to 1988 in capacity of a professor, vice dean, and finally dean. From 1983 till 1986, he was with the Addis Ababa University as a professor of international law. From 1989, he began serving as an ambassador, including the United States, India, and Austria. For 3 years, beginning in 1997, he served the Slovenian Ministry of Foreign Affairs as its state secretary. From 2010 to 2013, he was president of the Slovenian Constitutional Court. Since 2017, he serves as a senior advisor to the president of Slovenia. Professor Petrič, who is joining us from Geneva, will present his paper with the title 200 Years After the Congress of Ljubljana, Views of a Slovenian Diplomat. Please, Professor Petrič.
Thank you very much. I hope we are well online. It's a pleasure to participate at this important meeting, memorizing a very, I would say, very important meeting in Ljubljana 200 years ago. It's a pleasure to speak. I was listening to the predecessors yesterday, also today, and I decided that I speak now in a way summarizing the paper which I have presented and which I might present if you will publish a book on this or something like that. But I will improvise because I don't want to repeat things which have been already said. And I can say that up to now, this conference has succeeded pretty well to represent to the participants Ljubljana as it was at that time, 8 generations ago, 200 years ago. And also the international developments, the impact of the Congress, the developments at the Congress. And in particular, I was impressed by the speaker before me, Professor Supan, whom I also, with good feelings, kindly agreed in Vienna. This is an important meeting. It is important because we try to bring closer to Slovenes this very important historical event in the context of meetings of Holy Alliance. And it was interesting that when today I spoke with my colleagues here in Geneva, and I said that I have some engagement today with the Ljubljana Congress, nobody knew what it is. But then one of them said, a famous, a very good, excellent Sir Wood, British lawyer, for many years, head of the legal department in Foreign Office. Oh, isn't it Laibach Congress? I said, yes, it's Laibach Congress. Oh yeah, everybody. Also the head of legal department of Russian Federation and some others, they knew it. So what I want to tell by that, it is very important, and it is the first thought which I want to share with you, that we are aware that it was an important meeting, no matter how we call it, Laibach Congress or Ljubljana Congress. But in Ljubljana, I must say, frankly, we didn't consider it important enough to pay to it more attention in the past. I personally would like very much that visitors to Ljubljana and also experts, when they speak of this important international event, Although they may call it Laibach Congress, they understand that it was a congress in our capital, Ljubljana, called now Ljubljana. So in this sense, I highly appreciate your endeavor, all of those organizers and all of the Ljubljana and Republic of Slovenia authorities, which have supported this Congress, Congress after Congress, as it is called. And I also hope that there will sooner or later appear somewhere in Ljubljana something which will remind foreign visitors that this Congress took place in Ljubljana. Now, next, what I want to say is, I will limit my oral presentation actually to four aspects of these events. I'm not going to repeat what was said here. And I said, Professor Supang has well enough presented the developments in these 200 years in international life. I will approach this problem a little bit differently, and I can do it because he has done his task excellently. I will try to show what role the Congress in Ljubljana somehow played, part of what international important process it was, first from the point of reconstructions of international community in these 200 years, whereby I will give special emphasis to the balance of power. Because the Congress of Ljubljana, its main task was to reestablish order after 30 years of Napoleonic wars and to reestablish in a way the balance of power. International life is to a large extent, not only, I'm simplifying it a little bit right now, but it's a reflection of changes in balance of power. And here, I would say we can learn some things from those changes of balance of power in the past. Finally, Historia Magistra Vitae. And in this sense, I will expose some presumptions, some hypotheses, as a kind of food for thought. But let me first say that this Congress was an important event from the point of reestablishing the order after Napoleonic Wars in Europe, and also from the point of development of organized international community as we are having it now. These were little steps towards assuring international order, towards developing an organized international community, and Ljubljana Congress was a part of it. It was a part of it. It was an important event in the context of the meetings of Holy Alliance from Vienna, Opava, Ljubljana, Aachen, and so on, which have helped that the Europe was reconstructed after 30 years of war and was achieving peace, actually, through peace, a kind of peace without a great international conflict, practically through the whole 19th century. But first, let me turn a little bit attention to the international community at that time. In Vienna Congress, the victorious powers against Napoleon have somehow successfully established the international order based on new principles, or actually on old principles, but again re-established sovereignty of states, a principle equal sovereignty of states, equality of states, which was established as a legal principle since Congress of Westphalia, and of course also which was typical for the Vienna Congress and from the Holy Alliance, the legitimacy of ruling houses, of rulers, as a principle on which the legitimacy of states should be based. This was a situation which was skillfully handled by the diplomats, the great diplomats of that time, in particularly, of course, Metternich, and the great star of diplomacy from Britain, Castlereagh, and of course those who have also accompanied the two Tsars who came at that time to Ljubljana. You see, it was mentioned today that there were three empires at that time on the European continent: Russia, Austria, and Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Empire at that time, of course, was still out of European affairs, didn't play any role actually at the Vienna Congress. At the Vienna Congress, the main players were Austria, a power which was dominating Central Europe for several centuries, and Russia, the two of them. It is interesting that the British at the Ljubljana Congress, their participation was meager. Castlereagh was already sick. He passed away a year later. So the main role in Ljubljana was played by the Tsar and Emperor of Austria and by their diplomats, Metternich, Kenz, Nesselrode, Kapodistrias. And they have continued actually the work started in Vienna to re-establish the new and secure the new balance of power on European continent. The British meager participation was not only a result of personal troubles of Castlereagh, but was also a result of limited British interest at that time for the internal European problems. British were not much interested in intervention in Naples, which was one of the topics, the main topics in Ljubljana. The British were interested for their domination on the high seas and balance of power in Europe. And they had succeeded. Two victories, the victory at Trafalgar symbolizes the British dominance on the high seas. The battle at Waterloo symbolizes that the challenge, the danger for Britain of French hegemonic ambitions in Europe are over. And this game, that is my first hypothesis, existing relation of powers, balance of powers, which is a guarantee for stability. But then the change of existing balance of power, as it was in Europe, French Revolution, Napoleon, and later on again, I will come to that, usually then turns into conflict, and after the conflict, the balance is again reestablished. That is the story also in the context of our deliberations on Congress of Ljubljana. The Napoleonic Wars, the French Revolution have changed the balance of power. The wars succeeded to a great extent also because of British endeavor to keep the balance to prevent French hegemony on the continent. And then after the war, after the conflict, a new balance of power, sometimes usually on different principles. This story in which Ljubljana Congress plays a role, that's why it has historic importance, has been repeated then in Europe in several situations, whereby via diplomacy, via activities, first of the Holy Alliance, diplomatic activities, the great skill of Metternich and many others, in spite of the slight changes of balance of power, it was always prevented that this would lead to a great conflict. The same is the story in the second half of the 19th century, where you had serious contradictions in the Balkans between Austria and Russia, which led to the Congress in Berlin, 1878. Serious problems concerning Africa, which led to the Congress 1884, again in Berlin. In all these situations, European diplomacy somehow succeeded to limit, to control, so to say, the changes of power and to prevent a conflict to arise, a conflict on a big scale. Later on, when Germany started to be a power, a new power in Europe, with possibilities and ambitions to develop its hegemony, European diplomacy didn't succeed in that. Finally, we entered, it was described, and I'm not going to repeat it, by Professor Supan in the First World War. The First World War was a conflict which arose because of the changed balance of power. And if we look all the way back to the Congress of Westphalia, we could expose a hypothesis saying that balance of power, when it is significantly changed, means a danger for a conflict. If the conflict occurs, the order has to be reestablished. And here we have Ljubljana Congress. Now, it is interesting, of course, to follow this hypothesis and to look at our times. I will not go into the First World War. After it, the new order was established in Europe, the Versailles system. But the tragedy for Europe is that at the same time, 3 totalitarian ideologies took place in the main European centers of power. Nazi socialism, Nazism in Germany, fascism in Italy, Stalinist socialism, Stalinist communism in Soviet Union. It was a kind of abnormal situation, which in a way led to the Second World War, because the leaders of those countries, they all wanted to establish a kind of new order, communist world order, German deny ordering, reinstitution of a kind of Italian Roman Empire and so on. And the leadership of those countries consciously wanted to achieve it by aggression. So let us put this aside. After the Second World War, the new international order was established again. And it somehow was a kind of consequence of the developments. It was a bipolar order until 1990s. In 1990s, the balance of power has changed tremendously, but fortunately, basically in a peaceful way. In Europe, close to 20 new states appeared. The socialist, communist regimes collapsed. Europe was tremendously changed in 1990s, but it was a change basically in peaceful way. Now, 30 years after, now in 2020, we are again facing the processes of change of balance of power throughout the world. We have a new challenger, a new huge challenger, powerful challenger, and we may expose the question and ask ourselves, will this change, which is occurring of balance of power throughout the world, be handled, controlled, resolved by peaceful means or not? That seems to be, according to me at least, one of the main challenges of the diplomacy in the future world. One of the main challenges, how to control the events to the extent that the exchange of power will not lead to a conflict. In 1990, the change of balance of power was achieved peacefully. The consciousness of the world elite, world leaders, and of the people was that a war would be detrimental. It would be an apocalypse for the whole humanity. I believe that this feeling is strong even now, is strong still now. At that time, it was very important, the intense communication between diplomacies of the most important countries of the world then. I believe that this intense communication preventing some mistakes to be made as they have been made in 1914, which Professor Supar was speaking about, will not reoccur. That whatever will be the change of power in the future, it will be achieved in a peaceful manner. Let me, because of limits of the time, conclude this part of my reasoning. Let me say that one should see the importance of Ljubljana Congress in this context. Ljubljana Congress was a part of the endeavors of international community at that time to re-establish the world order, then European order, later on it became world order, I'm not going into that, by peaceful means. So Ljubljana Congress is a world as an important part of the endeavors to secure peace in the world. Second, Ljubljana Congress was also an important event in the process of organizing international community. Holy Alliance, and later on the Congress of the European Great Powers, the so-called Concert of European Great Powers, these are steps towards organized international community in which we live today. Hundreds of international organizations in the center of this system as the institutional center of the existing international community, United Nations, with many specialized agencies, and altogether several hundreds, I think something 700 plus, international, intergovernmental, international organizations. The life has become internationalized in all its aspects. There is a need to regulate it, and we are living now in a community which is institutionalized and which is regulated by developed rules of international law. At the time of Ljubljana Congress, there was practically no written international law. International law at that time was international customary law, as much as it was. Nowadays, practically all aspects of international life are solidly regulated with the rules of codified international law. Again, Ljubljana Congress was a part in this process. And the third, it was a diplomatic event at that time in Ljubljana. Diplomacy at that time was actually in hands of the emperors, of the rulers, of the sovereigns. Diplomacy at that time was not a profession yet. Diplomacy was regulated by interesting rules of international customary law. Diplomacy was, first of all, representation of the sending state. It was a relationship between two sovereignties. It was because of that very formal. It was because of that loaded with all kinds of formalities, beautiful uniforms, style of work, etc., something quite different to diplomacy in our times. But it is still one thing important. Diplomacy at that time, and it was proved at Ljubljana Congress, and now is an art, how to develop peaceful relations among states. It is still there. Diplomacy is a mean on disposal of states to peacefully, by negotiations, basically resolve international problems. Congress in Ljubljana was part of that. Diplomacy at that time, as I have said, was different as it is now in many aspects, but its basic function was the same. And here I will say that this Congress in Ljubljana is in a way a kind of invitation to Slovenia and to countries like us to think how important it is to have excellent diplomacy. Diplomats of that time were excellent diplomats. Kastelry, Metternich, Nesselrode, Kapodistrias, Kentz, not to name the others as well. States like Slovenia and Austria is not much different. They have no means of power, but they can have an excellent diplomacy. Maybe at that time, in the times of Maria Theresa, Austrians were informed enough, were understanding that they need a good diplomacy. They started the famous Vienna Diplomatic Academy. We in Slovenia, I don't know whether we are also aware of it, that we have no military power. We have limited economic and financial power and so on, but we could have, and we should have, an excellent diplomacy. So let it be this memorial 200 years of great diplomatic event in Ljubljana, a kind of challenge, a kind of invitation for Slovenia to think more seriously to improve our diplomacy to the highest possible level. Well, coming to conclusion, let me say, it is also now, these days, 30 years of Slovenia's independence. We are a young state. 30 years, it's a short period. In the times 200 years ago, in times of Vienna Congress, Slovenians were not even aware of themselves as a nation. We were a group with our culture, with our identity, but the idea of Slovenian nationhood was just appearing. I was listening to what our president, Boris Pahor, has said yesterday. I fully agree that at that time, the taking place of the Congress in Ljubljana, of such a great diplomatic event, had also an impact on our self-confidence at that time, which was important. Because finally, the growth of our nation from the times 200 years ago, when we as a nation didn't exist yet, not even had a kind of consciousness that we are a nation, to now when we have our own state, it was a great, great, great moment ahead. Even more than that. At that time in Ljubljana, our people could admire foreign emperors, foreign diplomats. Were probably fascinated to see the Russian Tsar and so on. But that was all the role which we had. Now, in 2 months, less than that, we will start to chair the European Union. Not just participate, but chair the European Union. Whatever it may mean, it is not something special, but it is something. This is a great achievement, a great result in 200 years, from nothing to be sharing the European Union and its institutions. That is something which we could be proud of. And even to keep in mind that 30 years ago, the idea of Slovenian state was an idea which many people believed could never be realized. It was, and in 30 years, we are here. We are here in the start of chairing the European Union. And let me say at the end, at the Congress of Ljubljana 200 years ago, the problems of Balkans were not dealt with. Maybe the Greek problem to some limited extent, otherwise not. It was still part of the Ottoman Empire, far away from European affairs and so on. But now it's becoming again an important European problem. One cannot ignore it. If we ignore it, we may have problems. So the central attention of Slovenia's chairmanship of the European Union will be devoted to the problems of the Balkans. We will have, I hope, in the autumn, probably in October, a great important meeting in Ljubljana, a new Congress of Ljubljana, summit of European leaders, summit, the highest level. Tsars are no more there, but head of states are still. Summit of heads of governments, heads of states, and the West Balkan states under Slovenian chairmanship. I'm saying that because in those days, in the world and in Europe also, and in Slovenia also in particular, there are many doubts, many worries, many necessary and unnecessary criticism and so on. But when we look at things historically, what Slovenians have achieved in these 200 years and in these last 30 years, yes, we should be critical, but we should be very proud at the same time. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention.